in case you are wondering what happened, I'm pretty sure my internet hiccuped in the middle of my live stream, and it's been totally fine all day, of course. And so I think it killed my stream. So I'm just going to delay a few minutes to see if this rectifies itself, because the stream that I just ended should be about 16 minutes, but on YouTube it's only about 10. So I'm pretty sure that I just continued yammering and nothing was happening. So I'm just going to pop down here and take a look at this. Try to redirect people to this new stream that I started. It is extremely frustrating when this happens because I don't know what I was in the middle of talking about, and then I have to wait also to see if I can get people over to the stream. So we have one viewer. I think that might be me. So I'll just delay for another minute or so until I can get people redirected. Um, so I think the stream is working. If someone could give me feedback, that would be great. Okay, Cheryl, thank you. I'm so sorry. Like it's incredibly frustrating. But hopefully we'll be able to kind of pick up where I left off. I'm really not sure what I was in the middle of talking about. Because I was describing some context about this particular limb. I think I have an eyelash in my eye, so keep rubbing it. So back in 2018, I went to the Center for Textile Research in Copenhagen, and I was there as a textile researcher doing a workshop. And I was able to meet with some colleagues about some experiments that I did as like a pilot study before I went. And they thought it was a really interesting experimental design, and they're like, yeah, it'd be great to see what you come up with. And the main reason why I was doing this is because the loom weights from the British Iron Age are kind of extreme. So, to put it in perspective, the Center for Textile Research had this 5-year-long program plus pilot study to initiate it, where they looked at warp-weighted loom weaving in Bronze Age Mediterranean, in the bronze, oh my gosh, I'm gonna start again, the Mediterranean Bronze Age. Goodness. Yeah, I have a lot of technical issues. So, you're all here and that's what's important. Yeah, so their loom weights tended to range in mass by about 200 to 400 grams per loom weight, and the ones that I had to look at in my assemblage were 1500 to 2500 grams. So that's quite a substantial leap. And even when I talked to the weaver that they used for this program, which, like I said, was about 5 years long, even she was just like, wow, those are really, really, really heavy loom weights. Because the heaviest ones she had worked with for the experiments were 800 grams. So this is actually kind of, uncharted territory. And so what I began with then, just sort of answering simple questions like, can they be used on this type of loom? And the answer is yes. And so I've kind of been pushing out boundaries where they make sense based on that. So the next set of experiments I looked at, which you can find that live stream on this live stream playlist. So on my YouTube channel, you can find it there. It was the Festival of Archaeology in 2020, and I had two side-by-side experiments set up. So I had two pieces of cloth I was working on simultaneously, and the limits I was working with varied by about 600 grams. And according to the Center for Textile Research program, their research basically showed that loom weights that have this much variance, where the width of the loom weight and the yarn that you're using are constants, there should be some kind of differences, either visible in the actual texture of the cloth or during the weaving process. And I encountered none of these things. And so that was an interesting result. And so I pushed the boundary again, and I decided to go from linen to wool, because there's actually a lot of wool during the British Iron Age. So I did an experiment with wool, and that was also kind of interesting because there really wasn't much, like as much difference as you might predict. And then I did another experiment, which was again a live stream that you can find on the channel, and I sort of pushed that upper boundary regarding how much warp tension you can apply to wool threads. So according to the Center for Textile Research, they decided through their experiments that an optimal range is 10 to 30 grams of tension per warp thread. And that experiment I was referring to that I did was 88 grams of warp tension per thread, which is insanely high, I have to admit. And I did succeed in creating a piece of fabric. So there's a lot more that needs to be explored about what we can do with heavy loom weights. And this experiment that I have on Loom now is sort of like the sixth installment of this experimental program design that I have. And so what I'm examining now is the impact of yarn gauge. So I've got thicker yarns on the loom now. They're about 1 millimeter in diameter. And I also have another warp setup that is 0.3 millimeters in diameter. So the idea is, considering the only change being the diameter of the actual yarn, how does this impact the visual character of the resulting fabric? Like, obviously they will work to make a piece of fabric, but I wanted to kind of push beyond just sort of the mechanics of it to sort of see what the fabrics are like, because ultimately what I'm trying to get at is populating concepts of Iron Age society beyond maybe what we would consider as clothing. So I talked a lot about this, not a lot, I've talked about it a little bit, I wish I could talk about it more, in my PhD thesis, which is available for free online. I think I have linked it somewhere. I will try to remember to link that below. But essentially, I want to know more about the range of fabrics. And so I'm not trying to say this is what they did or how they wove. I'm just trying to get a sense of what the loom weights can do. And if you are thinking about the practitioner, the weaver, there's a lot of stuff that we can do on our end that also impacts the creation of cloth. Now, I am a complete beginner when it comes to this sort of loom, because these looms just, they're ancient, but also sort of modern, because they were used in Norway even in the early 20th century. So it's not like working with a rigid heddle loom, where a lot of elements have been built into the physical structure. So if you think about making sure the width of your fabric stays really consistent, you have like a heddle bar that helps you with that. You have a very narrow weaving space so that you advance the warp regularly, and so it's easier to keep that constant. But with something like a warp weighted loom, you don't have these engineered bits per se to make sure that everything stays nice and even. It's a little bit more unruly to control. And that's kind of where the tantalizing bits are, because in a sense it kind of gets me thinking about the capabilities of a weaver with this type of loom. So I don't think enough credit is given to the actual practitioners, and so that's the other thing I want to do with this type of loom is add more to that. So as I said, I've got my thicker warp on the loom, and this is all hand spun. Now I know that there is some discussion broadly on the internet, fellow YouTubers, what wool is appropriate for these types of experiments or even reenactment. So I use Ryland because I have a lot of it. I was also using it for a different experiment, which I've not had the opportunity to talk about, sometime in the future maybe. So if I had a lot of it, and I had confidence in spinning it, and it seemed like it would be a suitable candidate for hand spinning, I thought, let's just go ahead and go with it. We can add more experiments to this program in the future. And so I just wanted to start with a wool that was hand spun. Up until this point, I had only been using machine spun. So it was machine spun linen for my earlier experiments, and then machine spun wool for my later experiments. And so this is the first experiment where I was using only hand spun yarn. Because I was using hand spun yarn, I could also add more twist. So fellow hand spinners out there know that you can add more or less twist depending on the goal that you want for that yarn. So if you want like a really nice fluffy soft spun yarn, you're not going to add as many twists per inch for that type of yarn. If you want something that's really, really sturdy, or something that is more archaeological accurate, you might want to go with something that has a very specific twist degree. In this case, I am modeling the twist direction based off the Hallstatt examples in Western Europe. So I wanted to kind of get a sense of what people during the time period in sort of a similar region might have been doing, because we have archaeological examples of those, but not for my study region, which is in Danebury Hill Fort, and that's in Hampshire, UK. So there's a lot of things that I've had to kind of do to make this experiment useful for developing more research. So that's essentially what I've got on the loom now, and I will demonstrate it here in a minute, but I just wanted to see if there are any other questions about how I set up the experiment. And I wish I could show you the loomlets themselves, but they're quite large. Maybe I can pull it up. 1 second. If I grab it like this, nope, I can't. I'm pretty much using all of the big ones on the loom, but they are roughly about like this big. And I think they all range between 17, it's like 1,717 grams and 1,750 grams for the large ones. But I also did an experiment where I used heavy and lighter loom weights. So on this setup, I also have a couple of lighter loom weights. Those are about, I think it was 1,050 grams. So that's about 700 grams lighter than the main ones that I'm using. And it's really interesting because you would think that such a difference would have a substantial impact, but I have woven about 3 inches so far, and it's okay. I haven't really noticed any differences, but once I get it off the loom, it's no longer held under tension. That's where some of the differences can be manifested, and also after it's been washed. So, Cheryl's asking, if I put a good amount of twist on my hand spun, it could be used for weaving. Absolutely. Even if you're using commercial yarns, they're fine for weaving. So if your twist is similar to what you see in commercial yarns, then yes. They don't have to be plied, but you do have to be mindful of work abrasion. So if you're using like a rigid heddle, that back and forth motion of the rigid heddle as you beat down, that can actually cause abrasion on the warp yarns in that spot, and so something to be mindful of. Fluffier yarns could have more warp abrasion, just because you got like the bit sticking out the sides, that's going to catch. But if you do have a higher twist yarn, you are more likely to produce a nice strong warp for weaving. Also the method, and now one of the things that I really want to do for this Iron Age textile series, which I've not been able to do much with it because it requires a lot of setup and prep work, and between not being able to find a job and spending a lot of my time trying to find a job, and then now having a job and trying to find spare time to do all these ideas, it kind of just is floating in my head. But what I want to do is talk about how to spin a yarn for an experimental design like this. So the best yarns that you could probably use that will give you the least amount of hassle is a warp yarn that's probably 30 degrees minimum twist, and something that is probably either semi-worsted or true worsted spun. The other thing that you can do is if you do a backwards draw and smooth down the yarn as you're spinning it, that means you won't really have any flyaways, and that is really important also to reduce warp abrasion. Yeah. And the captain is also confirmed adding a bit of twist in a warp yarn is good for your hand spun when you're using that for weaving. So, okay. Now, my loom is about 6.5 feet tall. So with my arm like fully extended up, I can just touch the very top of it. So the weaving is way up here. Hopefully you can still hear me if I'm standing over here. So yeah, this is me full hand extended all the way. That's about 6.5 feet tall. So in order to get started on the weaving, I have to stand on a step ladder. So I'm going to flip that around. I also have handy a couple of things. So, like I said, I'm a bit of a novice when it comes to weaving with this type of loom. And so I keep a tape measure handy so that I can measure the width. What I'm trying to do is, in some ways, rediscover skills that people may have possessed in the Iron Age. I'm not saying that they did have these skills, but knowing that a piece of fabric, you would want to have a piece of fabric be woven evenly, right? So the width at the top, same as the width at the bottom, right? The bits in between all the warps, evenly spaced. That's the idea, right? And we have examples of people who have clearly been able to do this in the past with this type of loom. If you look to like Bronze Age Denmark, for example, so you get a sense of the amount of skill involved, but also the consistency. So once you get started, it can be quite easy to kind of veer off. So what often happens with this type of loom is you get wasting. So that's basically when the warp gets drawn in. So the edges might have started off as 10 inches, but by the time you get like halfway down the length, it's like 5 inches. You're like, why does it keep happening? So this is useful for me to kind of check my progress as I go. And I am checking quite a lot, and that's partially because I'm trying to understand the impact of my technique on the result. And yeah, so having this nearby is really, really useful for me. Now, another item that is a bit unique to the British Iron Age is this. And I have shown this in previous videos and in live streams. I call it a long-handled comb. In the past, they have been called weaving combs. I have an issue with that because it isn't a broad enough association, because you can also use them for wool. Like I was alluding to earlier, I have other videos I want to create, but in my PhD thesis, I have a couple of photos of me using a tool pretty much just like this for carding wool, or not carding, combing wool, and it does that job quite effectively. I have a video of me doing this on YouTube, or not YouTube, it's on Instagram, it's a short video, and what's really interesting is it's extremely effective, and a lot of this warp yarn was spun from wool that I processed with this. Yes, it was time consuming, but I'm more inclined to think that these are multi-purpose, potentially. And I argue for that in my PhD thesis. So if you're interested in this type of tool, which is kind of unique in terms of an associated textile tool with this type of loom for the time period, then I encourage you to read that chapter. I have a published chapter, but it's in a book you have to buy. And you could access the PDF, but again, you would have to buy it. So please look for it in my PhD thesis if you want to learn more about it. They're fascinating. Now, I have 3 of these. This one has a bit of wool yarn around the bottom. This is actually based off of a nearly complete long-handled comb from Danebury. Right? It's made out of antler. The decoration was applied because that's sort of what the original had from Iron Age Britain. And the reason why I have several of these is because I am trying to get a sense of how long it takes to accumulate use wear. And use wear in archaeology is really, really important because that tells us how something has been used. And it could relate to a particular function. So by using it in these experiments, I'm getting a sense of what feels comfortable as a weaver when I'm using this tool, where the use seems to accumulate on it, and like how much pressure I can use. You know, these are types of questions as an archaeologist you can't really ask because, you know, the people don't exist anymore. They've been long dead. And because we're talking about archaeological artifacts, you can't put them to the test. Usually they're really quite brittle, and it could ruin any kind of future research you might want to conduct with it. So that's where making these types of replicas and modern crafters are so important to research. So I had 3 of these made. This one is only ever used for weaving with wool. I know it's like a pedantic point, but it kind of has to be that way so that I can assess it properly. So instead of using, as you might have seen with Anglo-Saxon warp-weighted looms, I'm not using a weft beater or a sword beater. I have one because it came with this loom, but I don't really like using it because it's super awkward. It's not something that I would find in my tool assemblage, and yet these exist. So working with what I have rather than adding in more potential speculation, I'm gonna see what this is capable of doing first, essentially. So what I'm doing might seem a bit weird or different in the case where maybe you have seen other reenactors or other researchers using this type of loom. They're probably not using this tool specifically, and that's also why I'm not going to be using a sword beater. Um, Captain has said, is your loom based upon an extant find? Yes, so this is a custom loom, and it was custom because my loom weights are about that tall. Can you get that in frame? They're about that tall. Um, about 160 millimeters, 117, I mean 170 millimeters. Yeah, so that's about how big they are. And in order to have enough space for the loom weight and the space below so that it can, sort of swing freely, and for the point in which I attach it to the warp yarn, that amount of leeway I need for my loom weights is much more substantial than it would be for someone using like Roman loom weights or Anglo-Saxon ones. So my loom necessarily had to be taller. I also talk a little bit about warp weighted looms and how they're set up for experiments in general, because we actually don't have any existing examples during the Iron Age of Britain, like none at all. We have bits of wood that have been found, but because it tends to be quite nondescript, it's really difficult to say. And there is some suggestion that post holes, so you dig out a hole, maybe you fill it with some rocks or something to kind of like make a nice sturdy foundation. You put a wooden post in there, you infill it with some rubble and whatever else junk you have lying around, you fill that in, you cover it with dirt, pat it down. That's pretty sturdy, right? And depending on how tall the post you're using is, you might want to dig down further to set it in, right? It's the same thing that we do today when building a fence. However, when a site might be abandoned, people leave, people move, um, maybe they're eradicated. Um, there's lots of reasons why there will be these remnant holes, and it could be that someone has decided they're going to repurpose a space, and so maybe that existing post has been removed, filled over, and then something is built on top of it, right? Something else. Or maybe people have left, moved, etc., and that post has just rotted in place. So the top part eventually rots away, the bit that's in the ground, that rots away, and so what you're still left with is when people initially built that post hole in that spot. So there's a lot of information we can get from doing an archaeological excavation to see what people might have been using this for and what they put in there. Um, it's like a lot of contextual information. Sorry if I'm getting really, really detailed about this. So we don't know whether during the Iron Age people would have their warp weighted limbs set up at an angle like this or straight up and down. Don't know. Because if you have two posts, they could be multi-purpose. They might be really useful for holding up a roof, or maybe even like a partial second floor in a roundhouse. And then those posts, convenient as they are, useful spot to weave some fabric. There could also be dedicated space, or it could be a more portable idea where you actually just lean it up against a wall and weave when you're actually intending to weave something, but then stow it away when you're not weaving something. So there's a lot of reasons why we don't know what they were doing, and even this is a speculation. It is based off of a large body of research that came before me, and predominantly influenced by the researchers at the Center for Textile Research and the excellent examples that we have from Marva Hoffman's work who wrote the Warp Weighted Loom book as part of her research in the 50s. She looked at Norwegian weavers. So I'm aware of the fact that I'm kind of picking a side here for this setup, but it's not the end all. It is one approach that I am adopting for now. There are other weavers out there who have done work. So Christina Petty is one of them. She did research with the Anglo-Saxon period and the warp-weighted loom, and hers is kept vertical, and that also presents a lot of other interesting ideas. But I need to conclude this set of experiments first before I move on, because I want to get this published so other researchers have something to refer back to and be inspired by. Hopefully build off of what I've done. Don't want to be the only one doing it. And then kind of see how these heavy loom weights from Danebury function in other loom setups. So like I said, this one is at an angle, but it's also quite possible that looms, warp-weighted looms during the Iron Age might have been vertical, like totally vertical. So hopefully that answers that question. Okay. So as I said, oh my my microphone. Sorry if you've not really been able to hear me super well. It fell down into the couch. Okay. So, hopefully you can still hear me okay from this vantage. It is not possible to film this while during the live stream because everything has to be tethered to my laptop, and given how tall this is, I'd have to have something this high, and it would be really, really difficult to have space to have room to move and not disconnect the stream. Okay, so I've just been doing a basic tabby weave here. The same yarn parameters for the warp I've also used as the weft, and as I said, I've also got this comb that I'm using to beat in the weft as I go. So I'll just do a couple of rounds to show you how I do it. One of the things I would like to do in the future is twill. But for now, again, because this is part of an experimental program, I'm just sticking with the most basic type of fabric that you can make, which is a tabby or plain weave setup. So I've got my weft here. I don't even think you can see that, but it is quite thick for a yarn. And then I basically put it through the shed, pull it out. I might have to go up a step. And then I'm just as when you are weaving with like a floor loom or a rigid heddle loom, you want to leave some slack so that when you beat the weft into place, it doesn't cause the sides to sort of pull in, because you need slack for the weft yarn to go over the warp and then under the warp. So it's a three-dimensional piece of fabric, and to accommodate that you need the slack. So I usually put the yarn in, hold it at one corner, and then I pull it up into kind of like a half moon shape. Like that. So I've got about that much gap in the middle, and on the edges I've kind of made like one swag. And then with this tool, I'm just going to push up the middle, and then I push up the middle first, and then I kind of distribute the weft up into the fell of the fabric. And I wonder if the camera or the microphone can pick up the sound. It might be able to. It kind of is. You can kind of hear that. Okay. So that's one side. And now I'm going to change the shed. Put the weft through. Make the same shape. Ooh. Change the shed. And the reason why I do that is because this arm is actually quite long. If I had some slightly shorter ones, this would be easier for me to do. But sometimes you just work with what you've got, and I didn't even think about this being a parameter for my custom loom, but there you go. If any of you have some woodworking skills, let me know. So I'm going to do that again to the other side. Go up in the middle and then kind of distribute it up. And then the last little step is to really pack the weft down, or in this case, up. And it's a bit wonky, and that's okay, because I'm still kind of learning how to do this. Come in closer just because I see a couple of things in the chat here. This is absolutely fascinating. I had never heard of completely vertical warp-weighted loom. I had only seen the leaning ones. I know. Peter Collingwood, the famous British weaver, in 1960 did a session for the BBC on Neolithic looms. And this was actually a really interesting time, because even though Marta Hoffman had been studying the Norwegian weavers and their use of the loom, I don't think he was privy to that information. Sorry. This is my old webcam that I'm using as a microphone. Sorry about that. I don't think he was privy to her work. It wasn't available yet. So he had a segment demonstrating the Neolithic loom. He also figured out how tablet weaving the warp into place could create a sewn selvage, basically, or like a complete selvage. And that was based on an archaeological find, right? And I think it's just astounding how astute he was as a weaver, like brilliant, right? So he made the same conclusion, and Marta Hoffman, viewing her weavers, also came to the same conclusion. However, he had the loom sectioned upright rather than at an angle. And one of the observations that he made during that setup is there is no like bad shed. All of the sheds are very easy to make. And I find that so fascinating to think about, because as a professional and expert weaver at that stage, even making an observation about how fluid the movements are to weave with this loom type, I feel like it's one of those things that it's a whisper, but it has a huge impact on what we think of when we're talking about primitive looms, which is this type of loom, because it may be a primitive loom, but it's very simple and elegant and doesn't cause certain types of problems. And it really emphasizes the skill of the weaver. So I don't know what the fabric was that he made. It might be in a drawer somewhere, who knows. But it would be really fascinating to see the resulting fabric that he did with those loom weights. So yeah, it is an interesting way to weave, that is for sure. Beating up rather than down or towards yourself, right? For your experiments, are you going for a particular picks per inch? No, I'm literally just examining what happens when I'm using thick yarns or thin yarns, but keeping the wool and the loom weights the same. So on this particular setup, I have recorded each loom weight by weight and in which row it's in, so that when I set up for the next experiment, I will use the exact same loom weights for the front row and back row. And because I've spun it from Ryland and it was all done by me, I'm trying to keep as many other parameters as constant as possible, so that what I'm examining is the effect produced by the setup rather than, you know, changing a parameter in the middle of things. Like, I'm trying to see how these all the multiple parameters relate to each other. But the way to do that is to isolate them as best as you can. So I'm not going for anything in particular. I'm just trying to be as consistent as possible, because I assume that people during the British Iron Age wanted to create a piece of fabric that was more or less consistent throughout, right? Of course, it's going to be slightly variable, right? Because I'm trying to be very specific with the parameters by measuring. Did they measure it? Maybe. They might have. In terms of the amount of leeway they may have given themselves, like if it's off by an inch at the bottom than it was at the top, is it really going to matter to them? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. Is it still a usable piece of fabric? Yeah. What could you use it for? You know, some fabrics, they may have been created more specifically with more attention to detail, and other fabrics maybe not so much. So it just depends on what the end use is of that particular fabric. So there are a lot of I don't knows, what ifs. So I'm just trying to kind of get a sense of starting numbers, basically. So I'll show you a few more bits. My leg keeps hitting this crossbeam here at the bottom. So once I do get a rhythm going, it is a lot easier to weave, but as you can see, it is a little bit awkward because I have to stand on a stool or a stepladder in order to achieve it. So I've got that in place, up, up, and now I'm going to just beat that weft into place. Once I get further down, so I'm going to be taking this to the Cotswold Wool Weekend, next weekend, and the goal is to work enough fabric so that it's easier to show and, more importantly, easier to film. So I will do some filming because I strongly believe that it is important to record yourself doing these experiments. There's a lot of stuff that I might be doing and not realizing that another weaver might observe and be like, oh, you're doing it like this, or have you tried doing that, or did you know that this is actually having a negative impact on your fabric? I would not know if I just showed a picture. Like, how would you be able to determine that? So I will have some video at some point in the future of like close-up video of me doing this. But for now, it's good enough for a live stream. Whoops. And I've accidentally pulled it too tight. And that happens sometimes because I'm still kind of learning. So I pull that up in the middle, off to the side, off to the side, 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 side. And so what I'm trying to do with this tool essentially is, what I'm trying to do with this tool essentially is when you have the warp, the weft going through the warp like this, if I push up a little bit in the middle, you have sort of like a point right there in the middle. So you have two little swags, right? And then if I go to either side, then I have kind of like these little swags or bows or whatever you want to call them. And so what I'm doing with that is if I have one swag to begin with, that's all of the slack I have to work with, right? And so if I push it up a little bit in the middle, I'm kind of splitting that amount of slack to the left side and the right side. And then when I push it up again, I'm dividing it yet again. So each time I push up the low point of a swag, I'm distributing the slack as evenly as possible. Now, if you watch other weavers with this type of loom, particularly from the Anglo-Saxon period in Britain, they won't have a tool like this, but they will have a really long bone pin or sort of like a needle looking thing. And you might see them drag this pin up into the weft, and it will make something similar. And then they take out the sword beater and beat that into place. So, to me, distributing the slack with this tool makes a lot of sense. Whether that's really what people in the Iron Age would have used this tool for, I don't know. But the more that I use it, the more use wear accumulates in this region of the tool. And because I have taken lots of close-up photos and measurements of archaeological examples, I can compare mine to those because I have examples of a tool being used, right? So I have the initial photos before I started using it, and then I have accumulated use wear photos that I can take periodically to see how what I'm doing is impacting this part of the tool. So hopefully you get an understanding of what it is that I'm doing. Excuse me. I think my voice is a little bit dry. So I'm going to do a few more of these and then check to see how well I am doing in terms of keeping the width pretty consistent. Okay, so back up here. In that goes. Lifting it up into the swag. Okay. And then pushing up in the middle, then to the sides. And then beating it into place. I'm also trying not to fuss with it too much, but sometimes I can't help myself because I really want to see the selvages. Other way. Get that into place. Form a little swag. Drop the shed. In the middle, up to the sides. And then beating that into place. Okay. So I've done about 6 picks. And it is staying roughly the size I want it to be. It's always a little bit difficult, especially as I move down the fabric, because there's no way to monitor the spacing of the warp yarns as you go. So if they start to, if the set starts to change, it will propagate through the entire length. And I'm not sure exactly how to fix that. So for those of you who watched a video that I posted, I think it was around summer last year. I'll come closer. Just because it's a little easier to talk at a normal volume. So the set is basically the number of warp ends that you have per centimeter or per inch, whatever your measurement is. So on a rigid heddle loom, for example, you have the rigid heddle, which might say like it's an 8 dent or whatever. And then depending on your yarn and how you have things set up in terms of weaving pattern, you will get so many warps per end, and that's like your set. So you basically have so many yarns that can fit in that space. And and weave patterns like twills, for example, where you have fewer connection points between warp and weft, you can actually stack them a little bit more densely if you wanted to, compared to plain weave or tabby weave. So what happens when you don't have something like a rigid heddle is you don't have a device that's harnessing all of those yarns and keeping them a consistent spacing away from each other. So as you're weaving, the set can vary quite a lot. And this is something that keeps happening to me, and I'm not sure what can be done about it because I'm not a good enough weaver in general to diagnose these types of problems. And I have as yet been unable to produce this problem with a rigid heddle loom. So yeah, so Captain is saying that in other warp-weighted reproductions, they've seen, or they're not concerned about historical accuracy. You would use a like stretcher yarn to hold the edges a specific distance. Other weavers might use a temple. I have seen this type of loom used with a temple, which it's basically a wooden tool with a latch in the middle that spreads out the edges and it holds it there to maintain the width. But that's not the problem I'm having. I could theoretically keep the same width, but the set at the ends, the edges, completely different than the bit in the middle. So for example, I'm going to fabricate some numbers for the example. So let's say I'm weaving. I get down near the bottom or the end of my yarn. And in the middle, right, if I were to do like a sample of my yarn or my fabric in the middle, like that big, it might be something like 10 warps, 10 weft. But when I do the same section on the edge, the selvage, it might be 4 warps and 10 wefts. And you're like, what? Why is it so different? And what happens is the edges, the final yarns that form the selvage on the edges, it might still be 10 inches width, right? Same at the top, same at the bottom, 10 inches. But the warp yarns in the middle have kind of like all scooted close to each other, so they're producing a much denser bit of fabric in the middle, but the edges aren't. And I literally have no idea what is happening, what I'm doing to contribute to this problem. because there aren't that many people who do this type of research. As far as I know, no one has done this experiment before using Iron Age loom weights from the British Iron Age. I admit, as far as I know. So the closest one I could think of was done in 2005 from a French site, and it was written in French. However, they made a lot of conclusions about their experiment with only about this much of fabric. The problem that I find with the warps kind of in like the middle warps shimmying closer to each other doesn't generally occur until much later into the production of the piece of cloth. So definitely more work needs to be done on this, and I'm not exactly sure what is going wrong, which is why I'm trying to get the work out there and publish it, do like the visual stuff, like recording it, putting it out there for free so that people see it and maybe give me some helpful suggestions, or, you know, connect my work with someone else's. Hey, did you know about this person? No, I didn't. You know, that's helpful. So, yeah, like the string idea is interesting, and I know that it does work, but that doesn't really satisfy the particular issue that I'm having. And so I'm not sure what else to do, right? There needs to be more discussion about it, really. Yeah, and it does change another issue I was having. When you're weaving with this type of loom, one of the things that makes this type of fabric really, really interesting is your starting bit there at the top is tablet woven, so it's already bound off. As you're weaving, the edges already bound off. When you get to the bottom, you can literally do the same tablet woven border to finish as you started with. So you basically get a fabric that you don't have to do anything to. It's just done. Yeah. However, the video that I wanted to refer to was a sample of fabric that I wove in part with me doing it as a live stream, but I also recorded some of it. The problem I kept having is when you try to maintain the width, but the warps sort of like shimmy around in the middle, when you get to the end and you want to do a tablet woven border bind off at the bottom, the spacing is all wrong. And it turned out so completely disastrous. And I talked about it in that video because it's really confounding, because I don't know what I can do on my end as a weaver, what I need to be monitoring as I'm weaving, or even in terms of technique, how I'm doing the weaving process itself, that could anticipate that sort of reaction to the fabric where the warps start to shimmy in. Like, what can I do as a weaver to make sure that either doesn't happen, or if it starts to happen, what I can do to kind of space everything out. Now, one suggestion has been to use this particular tool for that. It's evenly spaced, you can see, right? It's evenly spaced, and so it's been suggested that this kind of functions like a rigid heddle, so that when you're beating up into the fabric, this is working to space out the warps. So if you were getting two warps that were really close to each other, right? If you were to beat up into the fabric, right, with this, then the tines could effectively separate those warps a little bit more. I don't know, maybe. I mean, it kind of does that, but they also have a tendency to shift around. So, yeah, it's really curious. Oh my goodness. Spin Me a Sailcloth just donated $5. Thank you so much for that. Marta Hoffman, The Warp-Weighted Loom, Studies in History and Technology of an Ancient Implement. That is the actual title of Marta Hoffman's work. So thank you so much for pointing that out. Yeah, that is a very valuable piece of research, and I really wish it was more accessible than it is. I was able to read it, get a hold of a copy of it, because I was a researcher, at a university. I know the British Library has a copy because that's where I borrowed it from. If you can find a copy, it's usually quite expensive. So if you are very spendy, you might be able to find a copy for like $400 or $500. Sometimes you can find them more like $200, $250. But it's crazy to me to think that such an important and valuable bit of research is so expensive and almost unobtainable for the average person. But that is the title of the work. So thank you very much for pointing that out. Yeah, so I do know about Sally Pointer on YouTube, and she has done quite a lot of videos on warp-weighted looms. I haven't used her method of making up the warp for the starting band yet. And one of the things that I don't know if she has dealt with heavy loom weights specifically in the research she's done. But from what I've been able to find so far, there's really not a lot, and dealing with this specific question in kind of like a back and forth situation is difficult. Yes, Sally is also working, I think, on a master's degree from. I think it's in experimental archaeology. So now that I have free time, she doesn't, or she probably doesn't. So I've kind of postponed the idea of working more closely with her on it. But yeah, that's also another good point. Sally Pointer has other research, even beyond textiles, on her channel. Yeah, so this stream is going a bit long. It's about 20 minutes over where I kind of wanted things to be. It's her PhD. Oh, she's doing a PhD. I thought she was doing a master's. But yeah, if it's a PhD, oh, okay. People who do experimental PhDs deserve extra credit, because I didn't do one for my PhD. It was just like a pretty standard one, bog standard. But I wanted to do experiments in addition because it's really helpful for being able to discuss something like this. If you have experience working with it or understanding a little bit more about the tools, or like areas that you need to really focus on, rather than just be super general, I could be slightly more specific and explain why I was doing it. But yeah, I didn't have to do all the write-up for that as well. I could just, publish small little bits here and there that would be relevant for me to then cite within my PhD. But experimental PhDs are just like an extra level added on to it, and they're very difficult, I think, because of that. A lot can go wrong as well. So yeah, so she's doing an experimental PhD. That's quite a different level. But yeah, so I think I will wrap up today. I will do some more content on this experiment going forward, but like I said, I need to basically work the fabric a little bit more to get to a point where I can feasibly film it. And then hopefully get all of this experimental data I've accumulated over the last 5 years written and into a publishable format by the end of the year. One can hope. Aw. Thank you, Spin Me a Sailcloth, for the $2. Thank you for the stream. Always lovely watching you. Aw. Thank thank you. I'm really blown away. So yeah, I do hope more research can happen in the future, and I think the point about Sally Pointer is a good one, because what often happens with me is I get very wrapped up in what I have to do. So right when the stream concludes, I'm going to have to go and finish inventorying all of my stock for this event next weekend. And I need to get the rest of the stuff, like the overflow stuff that didn't quite fit into my new workroom. Got to figure out what to do with all that. So it's not just sitting around. So it's like I keep taking my small amount of spare time and chopping it up in smaller and smaller and smaller bits. But hopefully with this fiber show out of the way, I'll be able to get back to doing some more experiments and research-based stuff, now that the main hurdles of moving and getting everything set up here and Expedite working again, all that stuff, will be out of the way. It took months, and I broke my foot. I got COVID and everything else. So I'm just hoping that 2023 is gonna be the year. Yeah, so thank you so much, Captain, for watching and sharing everything on your end. And Spin Me a Sailcloth for your donations and other helpful bits that are in the chat. So if you're watching and not reading anything in the chat, please go back to the chat and read that bit. Yeah, I will do my bit to keep this content going, because it is something that I've been wanting to do and it nags at me all the time. But I just didn't have the energy because I had other things I needed to do. But now all that stuff is done, there should be nothing stopping me from doing it now. So yeah, and I hope it was good to at least see in part. It's kind of awkward, but you get the idea. And I'll put out some videos of me actually weaving this timely, probably in May, but I will do it timely. So. Oh, and thank you for joining me in the stream part 2 after the first one crashed. Technology. Okay, and then moving forward, I am going to be putting out some other videos. April's just been kind of a wash for me, just trying to get everything else done and organized. But I may put out some fiber event specific content next week. So if you haven't subscribed, please do. And before you leave this video, please give me a thumbs up so that the algorithm knows that this was a good video to watch. Anyway, I hope you guys have a great weekend, and I will see you in the next video.